Hey, what's going on, APUSH peeps? We have Chapter 7 of America's History for you today. I'm using the 8th edition here, but as always, other editions will match up. We're going to cover the chapter titled Hammering Out a Federal Republic, 1787 to 1820. So let's get started. All right, the political crisis of the 1790s. We're dealing with the Constitution in its infancy, and the Federalists implement the Constitution. Again, we're going to focus on devising the new government. Washington appoints 3 people to his cabinet. For Secretary of State, we have Thomas Jefferson. For Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. And Secretary of War is Knox. And there is Jefferson. There is Hamilton. And the cabinet really will be defined as conflict between these two people. Each of them is going to vie to have their policies and programs implemented by Washington. The Judiciary Act of 1789 was passed by Congress, which created the Supreme Court with 6 justices, one of them being a Chief Justice, and lower courts as well. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and these were added to provide a safeguard against government power and also provides protection of personal powers. Very important to know that this was added to mollify or appease the Anti-Federalists to ratify the Constitution. Hamilton's financial program is a big part of this chapter, and I do have an entirely separate video on this, something you should be very familiar with. He issued a public report on credit which urged for the redemption and assumption of all debts, both state and federal debts. So Hamilton advocated or favored buying back all loans plus interest. This was called funding at par. This was very controversial because many people sold their bonds to speculators at very low cost. So these speculators would buy up the bonds, and then they would be set to make lots of money. Hamilton also proposed, as I mentioned, assuming all state debts. So states that were in lots of debt from the Revolutionary War would favor this plan, and those with little to no debt would not favor this. And only after he promised that Washington, D.C., or the District of Columbia, would be located in the South did his plan pass. So he had to do a lot of compromising between the North and the South to get his plan to pass. And Hamilton favored the national debt. Unlike other Secretary Treasurers, he favored the national debt. He felt that it was a blessing that the more people that the United States owed money to, the more people would want to see the United States succeed. Without a doubt, the most controversial part of his plan, his 5-part plan, was this: creating a national bank, or what we'll call the BUS, the Bank of the United States. This was the cornerstone of his plan, and it would provide loans to businesses and help the economy. This is chartered for 20 years. This sets off debates about strict versus loose interpretation of the Constitution. Hamilton favored a loose interpretation, or saying what the Constitution does not prohibit, you are allowed to do, and Jefferson and his followers advocated a strict interpretation. In other words, only if the Constitution says you can do something can you then do it. And Hamilton also favored raising revenue through tariffs. It was a way for the government to make money by putting taxes on imported goods. Do not confuse taxes with excise taxes, which are taxes on domestic goods. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. All right, so let's talk about Jefferson's agrarian vision. We see the first party system developed. The Hamiltonians, also known as the Federalists, and the Jeffersonians, also known as the Democratic Republicans or just Republicans. Jefferson believed that farmer stones were the backbone of the economy. So the French Revolution divides many Americans, including the Federalists and the Republicans. And here is a picture of the French Revolution, the start of it, the storming of the Bastille. This happened on July 14, 1789. Washington issues a proclamation of neutrality in a conflict that emerges between Britain and France. And the reason he does this is he realizes that America is kind of weak at this time. We are not strong enough to get into another war. Ideological politics emerge, and again, the French Revolution was supported by the Jeffersonians, and they really saw this as an extension of the American Revolution, that the same ideas the Americans were fighting for, this idea of a government of the consent of the governed and anti-monarchy, he felt the French was just a continuation of it. Meanwhile, back home in the United States, we have domestic unrest with the Whiskey Rebellion. That excise tax that Hamilton implemented, which was part of his plan, well, there were some farmers in Pennsylvania who were really upset about it. So they rebelled against this tax, and it was crushed by the national government. Actually, Washington goes in and puts the rebellion down quickly. This shows that the Constitution is provides for a strong government, unlike the Articles of Confederation, which provided for a weak government. Jay's treaty is a treaty between the United States and Britain because Britain is seizing American ships, and John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, hoped to protect ships. So he heads on over to Britain, and the treaty did little to fix problems. There was no mention of impressment in the treaty, and Britain also promised to leave posts or forts that they promised to leave in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Guess what they did not do? Leave those posts. The Haitian Revolution is happening all around the same time as well, and Toussaint Louverture helped Haiti gain independence, and this freaks slaveholders out in the United States and the South because they fear what will this impact of the Haitian Revolution be on their slaves, especially since many of these slaves from Haiti are actually fleeing to the United States. So this causes some worry for Southern plantation owners. All right, the rise of political parties. Definitely know these two political parties, and I do have a video you can check out in the description below. So Republicans, or those that supported Jefferson, tended to be the following: farmers in the West and South, immigrants, especially from France, and subsistence farmers in the North. And they tended to be pro-French, and they favored power to the state governments as opposed to the federal government. The Xyz Affair was an issue between the United States and France when John Marshall, a future Chief Justice, and two other individuals go over to meet with a French diplomat, and they are approached by three French agents named X, Y, and Z that they have to pay a bribe to meet with that French ambassador. And the U.S. refuses to pay that. John Marshall and his boys come back home, and war hysteria ensues in the United States. The United States is very close to all-out war with France. We do engage in a naval war with them. It's called a quasi-war, but war was never declared. In response to the XYZ Affair, the Federalist Congress passes the Naturalization, Alien, and Sedition Acts. So let's break down each one of these, but definitely know that these are meant to silence opposition to the Federalists, or at this time, President Adams. So the naturalization laws increased residency requirement to become a citizen from 5 to 14 years. And this was aimed at hurrying the immigrants who would tend to vote for Jefferson and the Jeffersonians. The Alien Act allowed the president to deport foreigners, and the Sedition Act made it illegal to criticize the government. There were many newspaper editors who were favorable to Jeffersonians who were actually arrested under the Sedition Act. We'll see a Sedition Act again later in U.S. history. Now, in response to this, Jefferson and his good buddy Madison on the left felt that this law was unconstitutional, so they devised what are called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And these were resolutions or short little writings that urged states to nullify or declare the Alien and Sedition Acts illegal. And they drew on something called the compact theory. And they said since the states created the Constitution, the states existed before the Constitution. So since they created the Constitution, they can decide what laws should be null and void. And this is just a theory, and it will be used later on leading up to the Civil War. So we'll come back to the compact theory, and we'll come back to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions later. The Revolution of 1800 was named after the election of 1800, and Jefferson becomes president, ousting John Adams, and there's a peaceful transition of power between political parties. So things move very smoothly as the U.S. government transitions from one political party to another. And in his inaugural address, Jefferson said, hey, you know what, guys? We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. We are Americans. So let's talk about some sham treaties in Indian lands. After the Revolutionary War, natives were continued to be pushed further and further west. The Treaty of Grenville was when the Western Confederacy gave up most of present-day Ohio to the American government. And America begins a policy of trying to assimilate natives or bring them into American culture. And this will be used for the next 150 years, basically. And Native Americans will reject that. They were encouraged to assimilate, again, this idea of acting American. Most natives resisted this because it ran contrary to their ways of life. Women were expected to adapt to different roles. They were expected to be farmers instead of hunter or gatherers, and it just really drastically changed their way of life, so natives rejected this. Let's talk about Southern migrants. A few wealthy individuals in the South owned a significant amount of land. Over in the newly created state of Kentucky, half of the white men living in Kentucky owned no land, and this is going to cause problems between the rich and the poor. And we'll see the emergence of cotton at this time becomes so powerful, its nickname is King Cotton, and part of the reason why cotton becomes so popular is the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, which makes it much more fast and efficient to remove seeds from cotton. And this will lead to an incredible expansion and growth of cotton in the South and expanding into Mississippi and Alabama as well. Now, with the Jefferson presidency, this really begins what's known as the Virginia dynasty. You have already George Washington, who was the first president. Then you have Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. All of them are from Virginia. And these three down here, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, each serve for 2 consecutive terms. So it's 24 years of the presidents being from the exact same state. And Jefferson had to deal with a Federalist judiciary branch that was very, very strong. When Adams left the presidency, he appointed a lot of judges going out of office that are called midnight judges because he was signing these orders the last couple days in office. And this is going to lead to this court case, Marbury versus Madison. And the thing you absolutely positively must know is that the Supreme Court rules a federal law unconstitutional. I do have a detailed video on Marbury versus Madison. Check it out in the description below. And although Jefferson disagreed with a lot of Hamilton's financial plan, especially that Bank of the United States, he ends up keeping the bank, but he does eliminate that excise tax on whiskey. All right, Jefferson and the West. Well, Pinckney's Treaty was a treaty between the United States and Spain, and it's oh so important because the U.S. wants navigation rights on the Mississippi. And this allowed the U.S. to navigate the Mississippi, and they could even store goods in New Orleans to sell. The Louisiana Purchase was purchased in 1803, and Napoleon gained back the Louisiana Territory in 1803. And the U.S. feared they would be cut out of the Mississippi River because Pinckney's treaty was with Spain, and now Spain's not there anymore. So Jefferson wanted to buy New Orleans. So he sent 2 people, Livingston and Monroe, over to France to say, ho, 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 Napoleon, can we buy the New Orleans? That was a horrific French accent. But in return, they end up buying all the Louisiana Territory. So what is the impact of this? Well, it doubles the size of the United States. But more importantly, Jefferson, who advocated a strict interpretation of the Constitution, switches over to loose because now it benefits him and he needed a reason to justify the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson's vice president, Aaron Burr, he goes a little crazy here. He ends up killing Alexander Hamilton in the duel. Google or go to YouTube and type in Aaron Burr Got Milk. It's the first Got Milk commercial ever. It's a great thing about Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. So anyway, back to Aaron Burr. He goes a little crazy, kills Alexander Hamilton, and he tries to create secession in the United States in 2 different areas and try to create basically new countries. The second one being in the Southwest. And there he is killing Hamilton. Oh, sorry, Hamilton. You're gone. Bye-bye. And eventually Aaron Burr is arrested but found not guilty, and then he just lives his life as in shame. Lewis and Clark meet the Mandans and the Sioux Indians, and they were sent to explore the newly acquired Louisiana Territory. And they had many interactions with natives along the way. So let's go to the War of 1812. We have conflict in both the Atlantic and the West. So Britain is practicing this policy of impressment in which they're seizing ships and forcing sailors, many of which are Americans, into the British Navy. They're essentially kidnapping British American citizens. So in response to this, Jefferson persuades Congress to pass the Embargo Act of 1807. And this is in response to the Chesapeake incident, in which a British ship fired on an American ship and killed 3 Americans. So the Embargo Act requires the U.S. to cut off all trade with all countries, not just England, not just France, who we're having issues with, all countries. And this is a huge, huge, huge disaster. The U.S. loses lots of money. Other embargoes follow: the Non-Intercourse Act, Macon's Bill number 2. If you want to know what happened to Macon's Bill number 1, check out my War of 1812 video, and it explains it in there. Out in the West, we have people like my boy Henry Clay is a war hawk. He and others like John C. Calhoun are in favor of going to war. That's why they're called war hawks. So Tecumseh and other natives were provided guns by the British out west, and they eventually were defeated by William Henry Harrison. This future president also was president for the least amount of time, 30 days, and he defeated Tecumseh and the natives at the Battle of Tippecanoe. This will propel him to the presidency. And there's my boy Henry Clay. He was elected Speaker of the House on his first day of office. So the most powerful position in the House of Representatives, he was elected on his first day. It's pretty incredible. It's never happened since. And he and other Southern and Western congressmen, most notably John C. Calhoun, they pushed for war with Britain. And most Federalists were against the War of 1812. Why? Think about where Federalists are located. Yep, they're in New England. Very good. And what business are a lot of Federalists doing? Yep, they're merchants. So take it a step further. Why would they be against the war with Britain? Yes, it's all about trade and money. So the War of 1812 is not very successful. Washington, D.C. and my hometown of Buffalo were burned to the ground. Federalists opposed the war, and at the end of the war, they form a convention in Hartford in New England. It's called the Hartford Convention. This is a meeting of Federalists to address their grievances. They propose some amendments to the Constitution, including limiting the president to one term and increasing the requirements to go to war. Some of these people actually urge secession, and that looks very bad on the Federalist Party because the U.S. is about to go through a huge sense of nationalism, and some of them are urging secession. And this is ultimately like the death blow to the Federalist Party. It really just dies and it goes away and it ceases to exist. So let's go to the end of the war. And we're going to focus on the treaty again. And there's Henry Clay. Again, he is one of the 5 peacemakers from the U.S. making peace with Great Britain. No land was gained or lost. It was essentially a stalemate. And 2 weeks after the peace treaty was signed, it was signed on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1814. 2 weeks later, because news took so long to travel, the war was still going on. And at the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson, again, another future president, becomes a hero because he absolutely destroys the British. So let's go to the Federalist legacy. Nationalist Republicans, this new political party that emerges, they pursued policies similar to the Federalists. And this is going to be Henry Clay. John Marshall is the Chief Justice, and he is a Federalist, and he will really impact the government as well. He strengthens the power of the federal government and the Supreme Court. And that really starts with Marbury versus Madison. And he also asserts the power of the nation or national supremacy over the states. And a very important court case, and I do have a separate video on these court cases, check out in the description, McCulloch versus Maryland, he stated that not only was the bus constitutional, the Bank of the United States, but that states cannot tax a federal government agency. So this shows that the federal government is more powerful than the states. In Gibbons versus Ogden, this court case dealt with interstate trade, which is trade between 2 or more states. And the Supreme Court ruled that only Congress, not states, can control interstate Congress. That's another +1 for the federal government. When it comes to property rights, which is something that individuals are very concerned with, in Dartmouth College versus Woodward, which was argued on behalf of Dartmouth College by this guy, Daniel Webster, who was a very well-known senator and former Secretary of State, Marshall and the Supreme Court declared that contracts cannot be impaired by the government. So this gives a lot of power to individuals and property rights. Then we have John Quincy Adams, who was the Secretary of State under James Monroe. And Secretary of State is so important because it is seen as the stepping stone to the presidency. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams, all 4 of those presidents were Secretary of States before becoming president. And Adams did a lot of really good things as Secretary of State. He's considered to be one of the best ones ever. The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, in this, the United States gained Florida, and they also gave up claims to Texas, so they got it from Spain. And Adams was really the primary author of the Monroe Doctrine, which states that Europe must stay out of the Western Hemisphere, and in return, America will not get involved in European affairs. All right, we'll do a quick recap of the chapter. Again, Hamilton's financial plan, know the bust. Know who the supporters are of the Jeffersonians and the Federalists. French Revolution was an extension of the U.S. Revolution, at least that's the way Jefferson saw it. Neutrality Proclamation was issued by Washington when France and Great Britain had beef with each other. The Whiskey Rebellion was in response to a part of Hamilton's financial plan, but it was quickly crushed and showed the power of the new Constitution. The Haitian Revolution scared many slave owners. The Xyz Affair increased tensions between the United States and France. The Revolution of 1800 was a peaceful transition of power between political parties. And definitely know these John Marshall court cases. And the Louisiana Purchase and constitutional interpretation. And of course, my boy Henry Clay, be familiar with him. All right, that's everything you need to know for Chapter 7. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have not already, please subscribe to my channel. If you found this video helpful, hit the like button below and also share with people in your class. Put this on Facebook, Twitter, let your teacher know about it. Anybody who would benefit from this, please share it with them. I thank you guys very much for watching and have a good day.